Is there no Esther among you? She pleaded, imploring people to act like the Jewish queen. Her name was Angelina Grimke, a Quaker abolitionist who employed the story of Esther to encourage white women to join her in the fight against slavery. With an influential pamphlet in 1836, she argued that the sin of slavery would lead to the moral destruction of American society, and she urged other women of the South to risk their own lives, as Esther had done, to speak out against the evil institution and ensure the survival of their people. Read the history of this Persian queen. It is full of instruction, she wrote. Is there no Esther among you? The story of Esther, which is celebrated in the Jewish festival of Purim, has a special place in American history. While some have argued that the unifying biblical story for America is the Exodus from Egypt, the courage of a hero named Esther has also been a source of moral inspiration for Americans since the days of the early colonies. After being taken to the palace of the Persian king Xerxes to become his queen, Esther historically risked her life to save her people. At the urging of her cousin Mordecai, she acted to save her fellow Jews from the plot of the king's wicked advisor Haman. And to this day, whenever the name of Haman is read aloud during the festival of Purim, Jews blot out his name by making loud noises with rattles and by writing Haman's name on the sole of their shoes so that they can stamp it out. Americans have been drawn to the story of Esther because it is one of those few tales where the line between right and wrong, good and evil is clear. Haman planned to carry out a genocide against the Jewish people. But Mordecai discovered his plot and charged his cousin Esther to intervene with the king, saying to her, "Perhaps you have come to royal power for just such a time as this." We tend to turn to the story of Esther when we feel strongly that we know who our enemy is, which is why during the decade preceding the American Revolution, colonists were rebelling against British rule. Journalists and preachers turned to Esther's story to articulate their struggle for freedom. When the Stamp Act was repealed in 1765, the Boston Gazette declared that whoever had suggested that George III enact such a law was as great an enemy as was wicked Haman to the Jews. A century after the Revolution, Americans continued to draw on the story of Esther, no longer to oppose an enemy across the Atlantic, but the enemy within, the institution of slavery. Women like Harriet Beecher Stowe saw Esther as a prototype for women to use their rhetoric and logic to persuade men of slavery's immorality. The story of Esther inspired Stowe to write the best-selling book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, a strong rebuke of Christians who viewed slavery as a providential institution. And she appealed to their religious sympathies to make them feel the scourge of slavery. A year later, in 1853, Sojourner Truth quoted Esther herself in a pivotal women's rights rally in New York City. Speaking above the hecklers who had come to disrupt her speech, she reminded her audience of Esther's bravery in risking her life as an oppressed woman by coming before the king to proclaim there was a great wrong taking place. Since our nation's inception, Americans have found great comfort, inspiration, and strength in Esther's pages. Her courage and character and conviction have been heralded by advocates of freedom and equal rights for generations and employed to inspire their fellow citizens to rise up and redeem their nation by sacrificing themselves for a better America. We too live now, today, at a time when the lines between right and wrong and good and evil seem clearer than ever. A moment which feels fraught with a sense of urgency. Scholars like our friend Bill Leonard have described this time in which we live as a Bonhoeffer moment, after the German pastor and theologian who bravely resisted the Nazis and was murdered in prison. However, long before Bonhoeffer was ever born, Jews and Christians called urgent times like these Esther moments and turned to her story to find wisdom and faith and strength that they needed to face the coming hour. Stories of heroes like Esther are always inspiring, but many of us, when we hear them, wonder if we could ever have the conviction to act with such bravery in the face of such danger. But while the name Esther means star, she was not destined for royalty. In fact, Esther was as unlikely a hero as anyone. A mirror image of her own people in exile, Esther was an orphan who grew up without security or rootedness that comes from a stable family background. She was rescued as a child by her cousin Mordecai, who became her foster parent and guardian. And yet even her time with Mordecai was cut short as she was captured for the king's harem and taken from the safety of her home and thrust into the sexual and political intrigue of the Persian royal court. On top of all that, she was a Jew living as a foreigner and an outsider in Persian culture, which was especially noticeable in the capital city of Susa. Esther was a resident alien living in exile as a member of a peculiar tribe that was unevenly tolerated by the Persian dynasty. Throughout it all, as an orphan, a foster child, and consort, Esther often had to make the decision of whether or not and how much to reveal her Jewishness within the dominant Persian culture. Early in the story, Esther and Mordecai operate almost dialectically as foreigners as exile foreigners in that culture, sometimes hiding, sometimes revealing their Jewishness, projecting a hybrid identity. This required sophisticated judgments by them in each new circumstance. And as the plot twists and turns, we realize that the expression of their religious identity is not static, but always dynamic and responsive. As a queen, we might expect that Esther would be aware that she needs to own her power and exercise it. Yet up to this point in chapter 4, Esther has not identified herself as a player in the king's political circle. She has not weighed in on any policy. She has not leveraged her position to maneuver others into power. She's not strategized even to use her own body to produce a male heir, which was always the quickest path to power and influence for women at court. She's done none of those things at this point. She's made no power plays. However, when Mordecai realizes Haman's genocidal plot against the Jewish people and reads the king's decree that on an appointed day, at an appointed time, all the Jews would be killed, Mordecai grieves and senses the urgency of the moment and springs into action. He approaches his cousin Esther and demands that she must step into this particular moment, at this particular place, at this particular time. In fact, Mordecai contends that her personal history has led her precisely to this moment. He believes that she was born and raised and rose to royal authority for such a time as this. Because as a Jewish woman who is also queen, Esther is in the unique position to influence the royal court and to save her people. There would be great peril for her. Regardless of her royal status, a woman could be executed simply for speaking in the presence of the king, which our text today makes quite clear. And challenging a royal decree that was already made was considered suicidal. Make no mistake, Mordecai was asking Esther to risk certain death to speak out for the sake of her people. The stakes were extremely high, and Esther knew it, which is why after developing a plan, she told Mordecai resolvedly, "If I perish, I perish." She had decided by that point to sacrifice her life for the sake of her community. One of the reasons I love this story is because the great Protestant reformer Martin Luther absolutely hated it. More accurately, he despised the story of Esther. He called Esther less worthy of being in the Bible than any other book in the Old Testament, and he put it on a list of books that Judaize too much and contain much pagan naughtiness. To which we can say, be careful, Martin, your anti-Semitism is showing. Luther may have been uniquely vitriolic about this story, but he is far from alone among Esther's critics. Throughout history, Christian pastors and theologians have railed against the book of Esther for its lack of classic doctrines such as covenant and circumcision. They go on to detail the book's obliviousness to the practices of Torah and temple, or its indifference to the themes and of anticipating the Messiah or the gospel or the church. But according to her critics, the primary evidence of Esther's defect is surely the book's failure to mention the name of God anywhere in its pages, or any activity of divine providence at all in the book. In fact, Esther is one of the only two books in the entire Bible that never mentions God. For generations, Christian scholars, nervous to protect God's power, have argued that the reason God is never mentioned in Esther is not that God is not present in the story, but simply that God is invisible, in hiding, working behind the scenes. But the rabbis offer a different answer. They argue that God's absence in the book of Esther is intentional. It is meant to remind us that there are times in our lives when, for whatever reason, God does not act decisively. There are times in our lives when, for whatever mysterious reason, God does not part the Red Sea for us, send plagues down on our enemies, or bring down the empire, rain down fire from heaven, shake the foundations of the earth, provide bread in the morning dew, heal the sick, raise someone that we love from the dead. In fact, that's the reality for most of our lives, most of our days. It feels as if God is absent. And what the rabbis say, though, is that God is not always going to intervene for us. God is not always going to save us or our people. And that what Esther teaches is that we cannot sit around waiting on God to do something that we have the power to do. We cannot sit around waiting on God to do something when it's up to us. The survival of our lives and our own people that we love is actually in our hands. God has already given it to us. We should not wait around and pray for God to do something when we have power as people made in God's image to take responsibility for ourselves, to speak up, to act out, to be the change that we want to see in the world when something has gone wrong. The power is us. The story of Esther will not allow us to pass the buck, or punt the ball. I know it's football season. Shirk our duties, shift the burden, cop out, wash our hands, or abdicate or abrogate our responsibility to God, to the market, to other people, to any force we think is going to swoop in and do the work or save our people for us. We are the agents who have already been called, who have already been equipped by the living God, which means the task is already ours and ours alone. As the old quote that is loosely attributed to St. Augustine and St. Ignatius goes, we must pray as if everything depends on God and act as if everything depends on us. This is the message of Esther, the message that must become our mantra as we face another Esther moment in the history of America and in the history of church. The question before us is, what does it look like for people of faith like us to be like Esther, to take responsibility, to rise to the occasion, to risk it all for such a time as this? On December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval forces and air forces of the Empire of Japan. These famous words from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared war on Japan after the attack on Pearl Harbor, catapulting our nation into World War II. 1 year later to the day, December 7th, 1942, the Charlotte Observer ran a front-page story reporting that 125 people attended a meeting across the street at Queens College to organize a new church in Myers Park. Our church was born in a time of war, in the wake of a deadly attack on U.S. soil that killed over 2,000 people. Myers Park Baptist Church was founded by people who faced their own Esther moment and knew that they had been called for such a time as this, and then responded. One of our founders, Judge Fred Helms, recalled World War II was upsetting to all of us. Things were downright serious. We concluded that religion ought to be downright serious too, that it was time for us to wake up and get going. In response to the horror of war and Holocaust, they founded this community of faith. Other Baptist churches in town criticized their decision, saying that a war was no time to start a church. But Judge Helms replied, "We thought that it was as good a time as ever because religion is the only ultimate antidote to the stupidity of war." There were already plenty of churches in Charlotte, even in Myers Park, but Myers Park Baptist was not organized, in our founder's words, with the intent of providing a more convenient place of worship, nor to the end that we might build a church at the expense of other congregations. Neither was it that we might point with pride to what we had done. We were organized because certain people became possessed of a dream to meet the needs of the community as they had never been met before. A church that was free from rigid dogma and fundamentalism, bigotry and barbarism that characterized so much of religion in the South at that time and today. Our forebears were acutely aware of the ways traditional churches had harmed and excluded people, and so they decided to build a place where people could come and bring their authentic selves, where questions were always encouraged, where following Jesus was more important than any doctrine or denominational belief. A true place for everyone to find beloved community. Today, the world is still at war. Today, Americans are more divided than ever before. Today, economic disparity is an all-time high. Democracy is on the brink. It feels as if we could be one election away from fascism or dictatorship, and the church in America, in the midst of that, is in rapid decline. Do we still believe that religion is the only ultimate antidote to the stupidity of war? Less than 47% of Americans belong to a house of worship. Both participation and giving are down nationwide. 65% of churches have seen a decline in attendance and contributions since the COVID-19 pandemic. Many have not returned. In Gary, Indiana, just to pick out one town, for example, there are 67,000 residents and 250 empty churches. Experts predict that 30% of all churches in the United States, upwards of 100,000 congregations, will close in the next 3 years. What if the answer to the Esther moment that we are facing is the same as our founders? What if our answer to this Esther moment is to build and rebuild, to found and refound, to form and reform this church as an antidote to the madness of the world? What if each of us in this place have been called for such a time as this, to roll up our sleeves, to get to work, making this church a beacon of life and love in a world of death and destruction? Martin Luther King Jr. had his own version of the phrase for such a time as this. He called it the fierce urgency of now. The fierce urgency of now. And we could easily be overwhelmed by the weight of this present moment and what it calls of us, but we could also think of this moment as an opportunity instead of a burden. For such a time as this, and the fierce urgency of now could also be translated and claimed in another way: this is our time I know it may take hope and faith to believe it, but if we cannot believe it, we will never be able to seize it or to live it. This is our time, Myers Park. This is our time for love and liberation, inclusivity and community. This is our time for spirituality and justice. This is our time to build and rebuild, to put away all the old grievances of division and rise from the ashes. This is our time to shake off the dust of the pandemic and clasp our hands together and get together in peace for the work that we have ahead of us. This is the time to forgive and to move on and to move forward. This is the time to lay down all our old burdens and to surrender the shackles of tradition and to journey together into a new horizon. I know the task is daunting. And as Esther teaches, God will not do it for us. And we cannot wait on God to show up. But even though the future is truly in our hands, that doesn't mean we have to do it alone. God is still with us. And just as Esther had Mordecai, we have each other. If we are asked to sacrifice our lives for the greater good as individuals in isolation, none of us will be up to the task. But we are not asked to do that alone, are we? We are called and invited into community to do that work together. And there is great joy and love and fulfillment in journeying and partnering together for the sake of those who are hurting and building a beloved community together where everyone can find a home. For over 81 years, this church has been a refuge for the outcast and the marginalized. For over 81 years, we have never shrank before the present moment. We have always tried to rise to the occasion, to rise against the evils of segregation and patriarchy and anti-Semitism, homophobia, white supremacy, racism. We have risen together in solidarity with our fellow human beings by proclaiming always, over and over again, we are open to all and closed to none. And we need every single person in our fellowship now to take responsibility, to find their own unique way to serve the greater good of this congregation. On this Welcome Sunday, each of us have been called again for such a time as this, to respond to Angelina Grimke's age-old question, is there no Esther among you? Is there no Mordecai? To that I say, yes, there are. I believe they are here in our choir loft. They are here in each and every pew, in the balcony, in the homes watching online. I believe we are here and we are prepared to do what is necessary. We are ready to face our Esther moment. We are geared up for such a time as this, to seize the fierce urgency of now, to rise to the occasion once more, to be the church that God has called us to be in this city, in this country. Because here at Myers Park Baptist Church, we are not just Easter people, we are Esther people. We are Esther people, and this is our time. Amen.